All right, well, we've just hit 11 o'clock here in Sydney, so we might get underway. Good morning, all, and welcome to our first of three productivity-focused webinars, where we will today be stepping through the latest report launched by Hort Innovation, looking at the factors driving horticulture productivity. Firstly, before I want to get started, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we work and their enduring connection to country. Inspired by their care for land and culture, we commit to fostering an industry that respects and values First Nations knowledge, traditions, and contributions. My name is Lucy Noble, and I head up the Industry Insights function here at Hort Innovation. And today I'm lucky enough to be joined by David Pearce from the Centre of International Economics. The Productivity Drivers report that we're going through today has been delivered through a levy-funded project, and the final report, along with all of the modelling that we mentioned today, is publicly available on the website as well. Now, before I jump into the webinar itself, I just want to mention a couple quick housekeeping things as well. So all attendees attending the webinar today are muted. We can't see you, but what I encourage you to do is throughout the presentation today is to ask questions, which you can ask at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We'll be able to see those questions, and then at the end of the presentation today, we'll make sure to get to the questions, and any that we can't answer, we'll send around post the webinar today. As you'll be able to see, the webinar is being recorded, and so we'll post this online following today and also send around to anyone who registered for today's webinar as well. And as with all things, we're always eager to hear feedback, so a short survey will be sent around at the end of this presentation as well. So as you can see here on the screen, the Factors Driving Productivity report was released on the 25th of July of this year. So Hort Innovation commissioned this report to be delivered by the Centre of International Economics to do two main things. The first was to understand the underlying drivers of productivity in the horticulture industry, and the second is to develop an economic modelling framework to quantify each of these drivers. And that's something that David will go through throughout the course of the next 40 minutes or so. Really, through this understanding, it provides us a strategic lens to better understand and analyse the relative importance of different drivers of productivity in the hort industry and support our industries and through our R&D and marketing to really take action. As part of this work, CIE consulted with more than 40 growers individually across 6 states and territories and 22 horticulture categories, and then throughout the project also held 4 open workshops to gain input into really the practical shaping and signalling of this modelling as well. I think it's important to note here as well that this piece of work builds on the economic foundation and modelling through a piece of work that was done 3-4 years ago by CAE, looking at the economic contribution of Australian Horticulture project as well. Thanks, David. Thanks. So before David jumps in, I really just want to set the landscape, set the scene as to why this piece of work is really important and why we undertook this in the first place. So as part of the consultation of this work, not surprisingly, a few key themes came out, and really there was a lot of noise around the downward pressure being faced by growers that we know to be the case. Over the last 4 years, input costs have risen nearly 20%. We know labour is less available, more expensive than it has been ever before. In the most recent AusVeg sentiment survey, 60% of growers reported workforce shortages, and we know that on average, 35% of horticulture farm costs are made up of labour. Now, the 2 points are raised above. We know there's a lot of downward pressure facing growers and putting downward pressure on margins as well. Therefore, understanding the drivers of productivity is really paramount. But the old age saying you can't manage what you don't measure really rings true when it comes to productivity as well, which is why we look to wanting to conduct this piece of work to understand the foundation of productivity for the horticulture sector as well. The point is, though, that really what we heard is that productivity isn't new to growers. They pursue it every single season. And our role through this piece of work really has been just to distill those true drivers and put some quantifiable metrics and guardrails around it as well. So with all of that, I want to introduce and pass over to David Pearce, who will now take over the wheel and talk us through the report and modelling over the next half hour or so before we loop back at the end for questions. So over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. So as Lucy said, we want to take you through this morning some of the key points that emerged from the report that we prepared for Hort Innovation, along with a couple of pointers to some modelling which we did, and also which is available for anyone interested to download a particular spreadsheet model, which you can use in your own industries to analyse some of these questions. What I want to basically do is go through, first of all, be very clear what we mean when we talk about productivity. It's a widely sort of misunderstood term, I think, in the broader political conversation around Australia. So we want to clarify that. And we want to talk a little bit about what are the things that determine productivity. What are the market dynamics? How do they sort of feed through to affect the fortunes of different industries? And then we want to jump into some very specific things that we found in the course of our consultations to talk about particular groupings of innovation, which we think are a way of making sense of what's going on in horticulture, and then discuss a little bit about the framework that we developed to help think through productivity issues within horticulture. So what do we mean by productivity? You would have seen, I mean, Australia had an entire productivity summit not that long ago, I think originally it was the Treasurer's idea, and I think the PM took over. A lot of people conflate, or it's very easy to conflate productivity with production, but we don't mean production. We don't mean the amount of output. What we mean effectively is getting more for less. So productivity is about learning how to get more and better products or new solutions produced with fewer hours of work, fewer resources, and a lighter environmental impact. It's really about working smarter. Historically, Australia's rise in living standards has mostly come about through improvements in productivity over a long period of time. So new technologies, new business models, new forms of institutional innovation. And a very important point about productivity is that it's almost impossible to change productivity without changing what you're doing. So organisations increase their productivity through doing new things. So that means that productivity, as we define it here, is virtually synonymous with innovation. It's the same thing as innovation in a sense. And so we can use a lot of what we know about how innovation works to study how productivity may grow within horticultural sectors. So a bit of a definition. So productivity is the amount of output that you get per unit of input. And when we say output, we mean a range of different things, including the quantity of output, the quality of that output, the variety of that output, the convenience with which that output's produced for consumers, and the ease with which consumers can access the output. And when we say inputs, we mean a whole range of the inputs to the business, the horticultural business, that you're measuring on a regular basis. So that's your labour, your wage bill, your capital bill, the machinery that you have to buy, the land or the rental equivalent of the land, various materials, which includes fertilizers, pesticides, and things that get used up within a year. But inputs also mean other things that we don't directly necessarily observe, and that includes things like the natural environment, using the natural environment as part of the production process, which of course horticulture and other agricultural industries do. So the benefits of productivity, if we can manage to increase outputs for fewer inputs, there's a range of different things that we're interested in. And here we've focused on the ones other than just output, because these, I think, are particularly important for the horticultural industry. And something that we heard from a lot of producers is that with productivity, it's possible to improve product quality. So it isn't necessarily the case that a productivity improvement leads to output. It may simply be leading, or not simply, it may be leading to an increase in product quality or greater product variety, or potentially can lead to improved social outcomes and better environmental outcomes, or at least reduced environmental impact. And finally, of course, from the business point of view, an increase in productivity will most likely lead to an increase in profitability by increasing revenues or through lowering costs. of course, the relationship between productivity and profitability is very, very important. The main objective of businesses is to make a profit, and one way of improving profits is to increase productivity. Now, I mentioned that, well, sorry, go back a step. When we discuss productivity, when people discuss productivity in the broader discussion out there, it's normally referred to it at three different levels. First of all, at the level of the whole economy, the economy-wide level. And at that level, Australia's productivity is increasing at roughly 1% a year. It varies, it flops around a bit from year to year, but on average, it's about 1% a year. Or productivity could be referring to the productivity of a particular industry. This has been measured in quite a bit of detail for parts of agriculture. So, for example, we know that broadacre agriculture is increasing productivity by between 0.5 and 0.6% a year. Again, this varies year on year due to seasonal conditions, but that's the overall average. And within horticulture, there's fewer good measures of productivity available, but we think that, say, for example, in the vegetable industry, productivity varies between -1 and +2% a year on average over time. And if we look at all the various data we have available to us, if we account for what's happening in broadacre industries and other agricultural industries, we can estimate, we think that horticultural productivity is probably improving by between 0.5 and 1.5% a year in aggregate across all of horticulture. So that's economy-wide and industry levels. And the other aspect of productivity is looking at what's happening within an individual enterprise. We have a number of benchmarking studies within the horticultural industry, and what they show is that the top quartile of horticultural enterprises are up to 80 to 100% more productive than the lower performing enterprises. So there's a very big range within horticultural industries. The good guys basically having double the productivity of the guys that aren't performing well at that particular snapshot point. So three different layers which we talk about productivity. For most of this discussion, I'll be talking about industry level productivity, either hort in aggregate or individual hort industries, as you'll see in a moment. I mentioned before that productivity is really driven by innovation, and innovation is in turn determined by quite a few factors, but the two most important ones are incentives to innovate and an enabling environment within which that innovation can take place. And this little chart is actually taken from the Department of Industry, the Australian Government's Department of Industry, pointing out that there's 5 main factors that are within the enabling environment for innovation. And all of these factors apply to horticulture as well as to other industries. So one of the most important ones being international trade. It's through trade and international contacts and foreign investment, for example, that information is spread around the world, and we get what's called knowledge spillovers from best practice elsewhere in the world. And as we'll see, that's quite important within the horticultural context. Another key enabler is skills development, so continual improvement in the skills and of the workforce, but also continual improvement in management capability within enterprises. Obviously, R&D expenditure, very important to allowing innovation, and that's the space that we're in at the moment with AgriFutures, with Hort Innovation, with the other R&D corporations that you may deal with at various times. The domestic business environment is a particularly important driver of innovation. The state of competition, the access to finance, the regulations that may affect particular activities that industries undertake. So, for example, key regulations within the hort industry include access to chemicals, particularly for pesticides. Chemical access, as you know, changes a lot over time. And the final factor that's within the enabling environment is collaboration and network. So the ability of different producers to collaborate with each other and to access ideas through a variety of different networks that may be in place. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in the case of horticulture. There's a number of features of innovation that people often talk about when thinking about what leads to productivity growth within an industry. One of the most important ones is the question is it a product innovation or is it a process innovation? So process innovation means what's the overall way in which you go about producing things, finding better ways of engaging in the overall production process. That's the key innovation that takes place within horticulture, at least from the consultations that we had. Although it is important to note that there are significant numbers of new products that are produced within horticulture each year, and this includes new varieties of products, so new varieties of apples, for example, or other fruits and veg, and also different specifications or different ways of delivering the products to consumers. And this includes a lot of the pre-packaged material now that's appearing, or has been appearing for a while on supermarket shelves, pre-packaged salads, particular presentations of fruits and vegetables, which make the product look different and more convenient from the consumer's point of view. Another aspect of innovation is the extent to which it's novel. Is it new to the industry? Is it new to Australia, or is it new to the world? And within horticulture, most of the innovations are new either to the industry or sometimes to Australia, but they're generally not new to the world because a lot of ideas about innovations within horticulture do in fact come from international experience. And so that leads to the third factor: where do the ideas come from? And in our discussions with horticulture, there's quite a few different sources, but many producers systematically go about exploring best practice in the rest of the world. A lot of them do regular trips, regular study tours to major horticultural producing countries, depending on the product, of course, but these includes the US, Israel, South Africa, various countries which are large horticultural producers in particular products. So that's a very important source of information. And the other one is the technology suppliers or potential suppliers themselves. So the guys that are wanting to sell, automatic tractors or various information systems. Many growers have developed quite good alliances with these suppliers, so they're getting a lot of ideas directly from the suppliers. And the final feature of innovation is that there are different benefits and different barriers to innovation within any industry. Within horticulture, the main benefit that's identified is the ability to improve profits, that is, the ability to deal with the rising costs that Lucy mentioned before. The major barriers are capital constraints, so that is being able to afford some of the investment that might be required to implement new processes. Uncertainty, so not really knowing how a new technology might work, is identified as a very important barrier for a number of producers. And then finally, labour, which comes up all the time, of course, in horticulture. Implementing new technologies, new practices puts new demands on your labour force. And so the ability to train the labour force and identify the right sort of people is an important constraint or important barrier to innovation within all industries, but particularly within horticulture. So that's some general thoughts about innovation that we discuss in the report. Obviously, there's a lot more material there to go through if you're interested in reading through it. What I wanted to do now is just jump into some model results that give us some idea about some market dynamics of productivity, if you know what I mean. What does it mean when an industry increases its productivity? So this next chart, so this might be, depending on what sort of screen you've got there where you are, may or may not be easy to read. What this is on the vertical axis is a list of all of the horticulture industries that we are able to identify within the model that we developed with Hort Innovation, drawing on a whole range of data sets, including the data from the regular publications of Hort Innovation themselves. So we start with, the way this is presented, the nursery industry, tomatoes, cauliflower, etc. What the model does is separately identifies most major groups of fruits and vegetables. And what is going off to the right, this horizontal bar chart, is that we are reporting the effect of an illustrative 10% increase in productivity of capital, labour, materials, and other within. What have we actually got there? We've got capital, labour, land, water, and other inputs. And so what this is saying, for example, if we go right down the very bottom where it says all of horticulture, this is saying that if we have a 10% increase in productivity in each of these inputs, then this leads to just under 15% increase in value added in all of horticulture. And that most of that is contributed by labour, but you can see the other contributions from the other inputs. Now, the important point here is that all of these horticultural industries are very diverse in the overall impact of a 10% productivity increase in each of these factors. So the biggest impacts are happening from this model in other temporary fruit, kiwi fruit, other nuts, and so on, and relatively small aggregate impacts in the nursery industry, for example. Now, this is basically a result of the composition of those industries, the sales structure of those industries, where they're selling to, whether they're selling to export or domestic, and so on. This chart presents the same information, but does it in terms of looking at the contribution of the different underlying sources of productivity to the total. So along the bottom there, it adds to 100%. So for example, right down the bottom for all of horticulture, we see that just under 40% of the total productivity improvement is contributed by labour. And you can see then, just looking at the pattern of information in this chart, that labour dominates in most industries, but not in all of them. In some industries, it's other inputs, so for other chemicals and so on, that are more important. But labour stands out, and this is really fairly unique to horticulture in a sense. When you look across all the economy, the relative importance of labour is very significant, and this is probably no surprise to anybody, but it's something that comes across very strongly in the sorts of modelling that we do. Another important point to make is that outcomes for horticulture don't just depend on horticultural productivity alone, they also depend on productivity elsewhere in the value chain. So what this chart is showing us is, again, an illustrative 10% in productivity. And here we've just divided the whole industry into two categories, fruit and nuts and vegetables. And so the extreme left bars are showing us essentially the same information that was on the previous charts. A 10% increase in total productivity leads to a 9% increase in value added for fruit and nuts and 6.8 for vegetables. So that's the farmer productivity. But as we look across the different elements here, a 10% increase in productivity in the wholesale trade industry, so that's your wholesale markets, feeds back and gives a 1% and 1.3% increase in value added back at the farm industry. And similarly, a productivity improvement in the retail trade industry feeds back to just over 1% increase in productivity at the farm level. And similarly, productivity improvements in the services industry, so that's the industry, all the different services that Hort draws on, or productivity improvements in the processing industry, so that's the processing bit of horticulture as opposed to the farm bit, all feed back to give increases in value added to the growing industry itself. So an important point that you need to, when thinking about productivity, is you need to think about the whole chain, the whole productivity chain, in terms of what's determining outcomes for growers. So now we want to jump now to the approach to thinking about innovation that we adopted as part of our analysis here. And one of the things we did is in our conversations with growers and other people in the industry, came up with essentially a way of grouping different innovation options that are being pursued as a way to think about how to model them. So we developed 4 different, what we call innovation groups or innovation options. The first one being fairly straightforward production cost analysis. So this is building capacity within the enterprise to understand cost drivers and profitability within that enterprise, allowing them essentially to modify their own operations, to discontinue things which turn out to be unprofitable or unproductive, and to increase focus on things which are more productive. And from the evidence we collected, this approach, production cost analysis, could also be called benchmarking. It's an important element of what benchmarking does. Has the potential to increase productivity by between 5 and 10%. You can think about it as being taking the lower performing growers or enterprises and shifting up to the top end of performance. That will tend to increase overall industry productivity, whichever industry we're looking at, by between 5 and 10%. The second group is a very, very strong trend at the moment, and that is using a variety of technologies to automatically collect data on the farm or whatever the particular hort enterprise is. So getting insights from digital technology to improve farm operations, essentially. And automatically collecting that information means that it's always there, it's always ready, it's always available, and then you use that information to work through and improve operations within the enterprise. From the evidence we've collected on this has the potential to lead to up to 30% yield gains. So that's, production per unit of land or whatever the relevant measure is, and up to a 15% improvement in labour productivity through adopting these various automated data collection approaches. Then what's happening increasingly now is that data that's automatically collected is not just processed by humans, but can feed into machine learning or artificial intelligence. I tend to use those words interchangeably in this context. Feed into machine learning or AI algorithms to again to really use that information to spot patterns that might not otherwise have been available to growers to spot, and to really think through how to best improve operations given that data. And this, again, from the evidence we've collected, has the potential to lead to an additional 25% productivity gain. This is on top of what was already achieved through automated farm data collection. And then the fourth group is a collection of things, but it's essentially mechanisation or automation, applying those on the farm-based production and also in packing and transport. So mechanisation and automation, it overlaps a bit with the machine learning one, and it overlaps a bit with automated data collection, but this is particularly thinking about physical activities on farm to allow automation. So, the automated tractors and spraying technologies, for example, that are available, or automated technologies within the packing shed. There are some automated or machine-based mechanized picking technologies, but they're not as widely implemented. And I think it's fair to say that in our discussions there are very mixed experiences with mechanisation and automation across Hort. One of the reasons is that sometimes to automate and mechanise something, you need to rearrange how the operation was taking place because it may have evolved to be convenient to humans and isn't necessarily the best operation when you want to do various forms of robotics or mechanisation. And a lot of the people we talk to who have implemented automated or mechanised solutions have found that it did actually take a lot longer and was much harder than they originally thought. So this is something that's emerging. Evidence on this is continuing to emerge. But we think that in some cases at least it has the potential for a further 50% labour saving in some cases. So very variable. Now, the important thing about these four different groups of options is that they're all interrelated and they're not necessarily sequential. They can all be happening at once within an enterprise. In fact, as you get more automated data, for example, that will help you in production cost analysis. And as the machine learning algorithms help you interpret that automated farm data, that will actually help you understand what other data you need to collect, which will then feed back to understanding how to improve operations. So these are all interrelated. It's not so much a sequential thing. You can imagine bits and pieces of this happening at different times within an enterprise, but this is a useful way of trying to pull apart all the different options that are out there at the moment. So a broader framework then for thinking about how to incorporate these different factors within a modelling approach that would be useful for different industries or different enterprises to think through. We've developed a framework which basically draws on what's a very, very old idea and a very well-established idea within innovation. And this is this idea of an innovation adoption curve where a new practice is adopted within an industry initially slowly, then it accelerates and then reaches a maximum point of acceleration, starts to slow down and then reaches a maximum amount of adoption. Obviously, the maximum is 100% in theory, the absolute maximum, although within an industry, the maximum is probably not 100 for reasons we'll talk about in a moment. So this sort of adoption curve is extremely well studied within the innovation literature. Many, many things have been shown to fit these sorts of curves really well. And so that's quite good from a modelling point of view, because what we can do is we can use these curves, and in order to use them, we just need to identify really three key elements of the curve as it applies to a particular industry. So the first one is the maximum adoption rate. How high do we think the adoption of automated picking could ever be within the citrus industry, for example? It's not going to be 100%, but what's the maximum we think it might be? The second parameter is how fast will adoption grow at the point of half of maximum adoption. So that's that sort of what's the maximum upward slope, if you like, within that curve. And then the third parameter is how long, this is in years, in calendar years, do we think it'll take until we get to half of the adoption curve, half of the maximum adoption rate. Now this seems a little bit technical, but is in fact an extremely powerful way of thinking about adoption, because by analysing the drivers of these three particular features of an adoption S-curve, we can generate a lot of different options and a lot of different variants for different industries. So it's a very powerful way to think about the likelihood of adoption within an industry. For each of these parameters, there are effectively 5 or 6 individual drivers of each of the parameters. And so they are things like, for the maximum adoption rate, how well does it technically fit within the industry? Does it require a lot of capital? Does it require new infrastructure? Are there regulations that affect whether or not you can adopt this technology? Are there lots of substitutes for this particular technology? And how variable are the different end users within an industry? These factors will determine the maximum adoption rate. How quickly something's adopted depends on a lot of economics. So how costly is it and how long does it take to pay back? That will affect how rapidly industries adopt new technologies. How does it fit within the capital replacement cycle of the industry to start with? How easy can people see that this technology works? So are people who are demonstrating it easily visible? How easy is it to ramp up the supply chain of the inputs that are needed for the technology? Are there any particular policies in place that may make it easier or harder to adopt? And what are the macroeconomic conditions? Most importantly being what's the interest rate at the moment? So that's going to affect the cost of capital to producers as they adopt. And then finally, the speed of adoption, so how rapidly you're getting to that halfway point, or how rapidly you're accelerating once you get to that halfway point, depends on a lot of network type factors. So how much communication is there amongst producers? What's the sort of marketing and extension activities that the guys promoting the new technologies adopt in? How easy is it to trial a technology? Can you try it and reject it if it doesn't work, or are you stuck with it? What are the sort of competitive pressures within the industry? So if everyone's adopting this technology within the blueberries industry or whatever, what sort of competitive pressure does that put on? And again, can the supply chain produce the things needed to implement the technology? And finally, how risky and how complex is the new technology? That'll have a major impact on how rapidly something is adopted within an industry. Now, I mentioned before that we developed a spreadsheet model, so you don't have to keep all this stuff in your head. Within the spreadsheet that we developed is a simple little scoring system that you can use to answer questions for your particular industry or your area of interest. And by putting in a score from 1 to 5, the spreadsheet model will automatically produce for you what the parameters should be for an adoption curve for a particular technology within the industry that you're interested in. So this spreadsheet's available on the Hort Innovation website. What the spreadsheet allows us to do is to explore different scenarios. So this is a snapshot from the spreadsheet, and you can put into that spreadsheet what you think the total additional productivity will be. That's column C. And then you can put in each of the key parameters that I've just talked about. So you can put in what you think will be the maximum adoption rate, what you think the calendar year will be when we get to half adoption, and how rapidly you think adoption will be taken up. And that allows you to essentially play with different scenarios within a particular industry. So in the report, we've got some illustrative scenarios, what we're calling a high scenario and a low scenario. So what this does, it sets out for each of the 4 innovation areas that we discussed before, what do we think that overall productivity gain is? So for production cost analysis, we've got the 10%. In this illustration, we've got 12% for automated data collection, 7% for ML and AI, and 8% for mechanisation. And then in the high innovation scenario, we're assuming that production cost analysis will be adopted by 90% of this. Is for these illustrations, it's all of horticulture, but you can focus on a specific industry, 80% for automated data collection, and so on. And then we've got various different years of the speed with which we'll get to half adoption. And then in the low scenario, we've got the same total gain, but we're experimenting with different maximum adoption rates and different years within which half adoption happens. So, for example, in mechanisation and automation, it's 2036 in the high case, but not till 2040 in the low case. And it's a flat curve because we've got a very slow assumption as opposed to a slow assumption in the low versus the high. So you can draw a picture. You can see what these different what these different adoption profiles look like. In the high case, we're moving up very rapidly in both production cost and automated farm data collection, and in the low case, you can see it's moving up much slower. So this allows us to sort of experiment. How much does it matter, right? What does it matter if we have these different profiles? Then when we run that through our model, again, this is for all of horticulture, what we see is these three different lines. So the very bottom line, the green line, is what we just call business as usual. So in this line, the industry is growing, but it's growing because of, there's more exports or production's increasing, all the sort of underlying drivers, the population's growing, and so therefore demanding more horticulture, etc. Just business as usual underlying growers, and then we've overlaid on top the low and the high scenarios. And you can see that over time, the difference between those two scenarios in terms of the value added of the whole industry can become very large. And so just looking at that in a bit more detail, what we have in the high scenario is that value added in the industry starts at 8 billion and by 2040 grows to 22 billion. So that's allowing roughly growth of about $1 billion a year on average. Whereas in the low scenario, we're going from 8 to 17, which is 0.6 of $1 billion a year, compared with the base, which is much, much lower. So what you can see is that under these different scenarios, there's different outcomes for the industry. And so that allows us to think about, okay, well, how much does it matter to be able to increase uptake of particular technologies? What's the dollar amount at the end? And that gives us some guidance about, well, how much should we spend on trying to get that particular outcome? So that's some basic modelling results. Again, a lot more to be said about those, but you can, as I said, have a look at the report or play with the tool yourself. When we do have this modelling tool, which incorporates all of this information that allows industry groups to develop scenarios for future planning, or to compare the impact of different productivity developments, or to test the effects of changes in adoption drivers, perhaps might be driven by government policies or industry actions. How much do they matter? To assess the incremental effects of improved adoption, what's it worth? Or alternatively, to look from the other point of view, what are the productivity assumptions that would be needed to generate particular targets for industry growth? So working from the target back to what do we need to achieve? All different ways of analysing what's going on within a particular industry, using a consistent framework and using the best data that's available, consistently added up across different industries. Finally, what are some lessons or where to focus next? I think what we came away with after our discussions with growers and industries, that it's very good to encourage productivity discussions within industries to start to think about how these issues emerge and what it means to the industry. Also, I think it's important to create opportunities for productivity conversations across industries. So not just within an industry group, but to create conversations between I don't know, the olive industry and the banana industry, for example, two industries that are, literally opposite ends of Australia. But we discovered in the course of our consultations that even though on the face of it, these are very, very different industries, there are some common lessons that they're learning, so that there's some good opportunity for cross-fertilisation there. I think it's very important to take advantage of benchmarking studies and to enhance that benchmarking with an understanding of what practices lead to particular changes in profitability and productivity. I've got here seek to further understand hidden productivity. What I mean by that is where productivity has allowed improved environmental outcomes, which may not otherwise have been measured in any sort of formal sense. There are cases where growers are adopting a variety of different growing practices which are much better for the environment. I think it's important for the industry to understand where that's taking place. And I think it's important for the industry to understand how important consumer convenience via innovations is, and how that convenience at the consumer end then feeds back to benefit growers by benefiting consumers. We see that there's a number of different possibilities there, and I think it's worth continuing to understand that. So that's a brief summary of where we're up to with this report, some of the key ideas. I'd encourage you to have a read if you're interested, and of course jump in with some questions. But back over to Lucy for the moment.
Thanks, David. And you've done a good job compressing the entire report into 35 minutes, I think. Before we jump into the questions, and I can see a couple have come through, so I will get to those. If you have any more questions, I encourage you to put them into the Zoom question and answer down the bottom. But I just wanted to touch on two more webinars that we have coming up over the next month. So I mentioned at the start that we're running a productivity series. Foundation is this productivity report. But the second webinar we have coming up on the 3rd of November is really focusing in on those first and second productivity driver groupings that David mentioned, looking at capability building and data automation. So as part of this webinar, what we will be doing is hosting some of our delivery partners who are delivering some of the specific industry benchmarking projects. And over the course of that webinar, looking at some of the key insights that we're seeing coming out of those projects over the last couple of years, and also look more specifically at some of the grower capability building outcomes and the benefits of those projects too. And then the third webinar on the 26th of November, we'll be looking at the third and fourth groupings of productivity drivers at AI and machine learning, and then also the automation and mechanisation. So as part of that webinar, we'll be hosting Blue White Robotics, who are the delivery partner of a Frontiers Fund project that we're looking at. So really great webinars. The QR codes there will sign you up for the Zoom webinars, but then also all of the post-webinar communications from today too will have links to sign up for those. So with that, we might get to some questions that have come through, David. And as I look at those, I will start off with a simple question, David. Value added, what is value added, and why is value added used in this context and throughout the report instead of, say, GVP?
Yeah, so value. So people are most used to the gross value of production, which is the total value of sales of a particular industry. Value added is the total value of sales less materials cost. So what it is, it's profit, so returns to capital. So it's the profit that is retained in the industry, added to the amount which the industry is paying workers, so labour, value added by labour, so the labour bill. So it's the returns to capital and the returns to labour. So we use these as measures rather than gross value of production, because they really get at, first of all, productivity increasing profitability, and secondly, because labour is such an important issue within the horticultural industries, it's important to understand whether the capacity to pay workers has increased as a result of productivity improvement. So value added, returns to labour plus returns to capital, captures both of those ideas much better than the gross value of sales does, or gross value of production.
Perfect. Thank you, David. I'll ask one question that's come through here around, David, could you provide some insights on how data collection and AI would increase productivity on the ground?
Yeah, so on the ground, so essentially, so they do it via efficiency, and via being able to observe, if you like, efficiencies within an operation. So there's some examples. Imagine you have a particular imagine you have a protected horticulture and you've got different rows of whatever it is you're growing, and the workers have to come in and move up and down the rows to do particular actions with the product or to harvest the product. You can have an automated system whereby the time it takes for each worker to do that and the amount of growth that you have within each row is automatically collected each day. And at the end of the day, you can see, for example, who are the workers that are more or less productive than others, and which are the rows that are doing better than others. So with that automated information, so when it's become automated, it's cost you nothing to collect it, but the information is available. You can then go about reallocating your operations. So you might think that, well, this particular worker, he's better at doing A than he is at doing B. We make sure he does A or she does A rather than B. And that's a way of improving productivity within the system. Where AI helps or may help, where machine learning can help, is that if you've got a very large amount of data, which is very hard for an individual to process, the particular algorithms can point out things or spot patterns that might not otherwise have been available. AI is also used in identification of pests and diseases. So things like rapid aim for identifying fruit fly, for example, various other ways. AI is also used in sizing, in looking at, say, some bits of the nut industry, in looking at the trees, getting a picture of the different nuts, and automatically producing information on the relative sizes of those nuts that are ready to be harvested, which you can then use to prepare your processing and packaging facilities. So these are two specific examples. Horticulture is so diverse that there's lots of different ways it can apply, but they're a couple of cases.
Thanks, David. There's another more of a comment here around insights for growers and demonstrable actions. And also worth noting that kind of through this project as well, there are a number of case studies looking at specific growers that David spoke to throughout the consultations, and specifically how they're applying different elements kind of mentioned throughout this report, more in the theoretical kind of component, and how they're working them on farm as well. So there's a number of case studies on the website that I refer to there as well. Noting that we've got a few minutes left, David, one more question that's come through here around the drivers, the 4 productivity drivers being very technology focused, and wondering how investments in crop protectants, trade, market access, how they're accounted for in the modelling and the project.
Yeah, so in the modelling, so crop protection, biosecurity, all of the usual, what you might call business as usual activities of a growing industry are accounted for in our business as usual case. So that's already built in. We know that there's a certain amount of cost will be incurred in managing fruit fly or whatever. And similarly, growth in market access in foreign countries, for example, is accounted for in our business as usual case. And then what we're doing is overlaying on top of that the possibility of these technologies improving the way in which you do that. So, automated technologies have enormous potential to improve the efficiency with which biosecurity and crop protection takes place, for example. That in itself will help with market access, because to the extent you can automatically identify whether particular pests are present, etc., helps in market access negotiations and so on. So that's something that we've tried to incorporate both through business as usual and thinking through the incremental benefits.
Thanks, David. There's been a few questions coming in the last couple minutes, so we'll see how we go getting to these. An interesting question here, David, around have you studied how far the research by public and private institutions can help in reducing the uncertainty in the adoption of innovation by industries?
So only in a general sense. So it's clearly very important because a number of growers that we spoke to are actively involved with research. So I'm sure you're aware, there's particular research locations throughout Australia, some in the regions, and the growers are actively involved in interacting with researchers in order to understand the technology, and the researchers interact with the growers by using, for example, sample plots on a particular farm or whatever. So I think that interaction is really important. The research, horticulture is interesting, particularly internationally, is that there's a lot of research by private institutions taking place. And my understanding from talking to growers is that they're really accessing that and trying to understand whether this research is relevant to them. And in some cases, the answer is like no, right? In some cases, the answer is, okay, this is wonderful technology, but for a variety of reasons, it's not suitable for us now. And that's a useful piece of information. It may be suitable at some point in the future. So I think the underlying research and the networks that are generated are very important as determinants of adoption.
Beauty. Thank you, David. With that, we might pull up, but there are a few questions here that we haven't got to as kind of general process after webinar. Any questions that we've answered today, as well as other questions that have come through, we will answer and send around or post on the website along with the recording. So with all of that, I'd like to thank David for joining me today and walking us through the report. I want to thank everyone as well who's joined online and asked questions. I really appreciate it. And as a reminder, the report, the modelling, everything spoken about today, as well as the case studies, will be posted online, as well as a recording of this session that will be sent around to anyone who registered. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at communications@horticulture.com.au, and look forward to hearing your feedback in the post-webinar survey, and encourage you to sign up to the following 2 webinars as part of this series as well. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.